Even that night, I thought the backyard of my own house was the safest place in the world. Then, from within the darkness, a voice called out my name. Hello, friends. Welcome to today's episode of True Horror Vault. For many, a summer night means barbecue, cold drinks, sharing stories beside a bonfire, and spending some quiet time in one's own backyard. But sometimes, that very familiar place can transform into a spot where you won't even believe your own eyes. In today's episode, I will tell you 2 chilling summer night incidents from the suburbs. No supernatural spirits, no fairy tales, rather, a fear that is far more real. Because the scariest part is that the person standing in the dark might not always be a stranger. Let's dive into the first incident. My name is Ethan Parker. This happened in July 2023 in a quiet suburb near Columbus, Ohio. I was in my late 20s at the time, living alone in a small 2-story house. My home had a medium-sized backyard. On one side stood a small wooden shed, and directly behind it were several dense trees and bushes. It wasn't a full forest, but at night, that area looked almost pitch black from inside the house. During the summer, I often spent my evenings sitting in the backyard. That night was no different. It was around 11:40 p.m. I was sitting on a folding chair, sipping a cold drink. I was scrolling through my phone, occasionally looking up at the sky. Everything felt completely normal. Then I heard a noise. The sound came from the direction of the trees behind my backyard. I didn't pay much attention at first. I assumed it was a raccoon or some other small animal. But a few seconds later, I heard it again. This time, a little closer. I turned off my phone screen and peered into surroundings. I couldn't see anything. I stood up from my chair. Hello? No answer. I waited a few seconds. Then I sat back down. I told myself, probably an animal. Oddly enough, I didn't hear any more animal sounds after that. Just silence. About 10 minutes later, I noticed my shed door was standing slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it earlier in the evening. I got up and took a few steps toward it. Then I froze. The shed door wasn't swaying in the wind. It was completely still. I switched on my phone's flashlight. I looked inside. Old lawn equipment, a toolbox, a few storage boxes. Everything was normal. No one was there. I pulled the door shut. Then I turned around to go back inside. Right at that moment, my eyes caught the dark space next to the shed. It looked as though something had moved. I swung the flashlight over. Nothing. Without delaying any further, I went inside and locked the door. I didn't think too much about it that night. However, the exact same thing happened the following night. Around midnight, I was out in the backyard again. This time, I was a bit more alert. Suddenly, I heard a sound from the direction of the trees. Then another. This time, it was clear. Someone was walking. I stood up. Who's there? Silence. With flashlight in hand, I slowly walked toward the shed. That was when I noticed something strange. On the grass, leading from behind the shed toward my house, were several flattened footprints. They weren't very clear, but one thing was certain. Those were not the prints of a raccoon. I immediately went inside and locked the door. The next morning, I inspected the entire backyard. I didn't find any sign of a person. However, behind the shed, tucked behind an old wooden crate, lay an empty water bottle. It didn't belong to me. I considered calling the police. Yet, part of me still thought perhaps a neighbor had wandered onto the property by mistake. I didn't go out to the backyard that night, nor the night after. On the third night, the situation took a far more terrifying turn. I was lying in my bedroom. It was around 1:15 a.m. Suddenly, I heard a sound coming from the direction of the backyard. A tap, then again, tap, tap. I got out of bed and went to the window. I pulled back the curtain and looked outside. At first, I couldn't see anything. Then, in the dark section of the backyard, I caught sight of a shadow. A person. He was standing right next to my shed, completely motionless. A wave of dread washed over me. I immediately closed the curtain. I grabbed my phone, preparing to dial 911. Before I could The handle of my back door moved. Once. Then again. I stood completely frozen. Someone was trying to open the door from the outside. I didn't make a sound. After a few seconds, the handle stopped moving. Then I heard footsteps retreating into the backyard. I called the police. A few minutes later, officers arrived and searched the backyard and the surrounding area. Initially, they found no one. However, one officer went behind the shed and discovered something. An old blanket laid out on the ground. Underneath, it was a backpack. Inside were a few food wrappers, water bottles, a flashlight, and several small personal items. The officer informed me that the individual had likely been lurking around my property for some time. The most unsettling detail came to light the following day. My next-door neighbor's security camera had captured footage over the previous few nights. The footage revealed that around 2 a.m., a man would approach my backyard fence. Sometimes he climbed inside. Other times, he simply stood there for several minutes, staring up at my house windows. I watched that footage. That was the exact moment I realized. On those nights, I had been sitting peacefully in the backyard scrolling on my phone. I hadn't been alone at all. I just didn't realize someone was watching me. After that incident, I installed motion sensor security lights, cameras, and new locks all around the backyard. To this day, whenever I hear the sound of footsteps on dry leaves coming from the backyard on a summer night, I don't pull back the window curtain, because now I know that just because you can't see anything in the dark doesn't mean there is no one there. Friends, you just heard our first story. A person was sitting in his own backyard, completely unaware that someone could be hiding so close to him day after day. But the next story is even more unsettling, because the fear didn't start with spotting a stranger. Rather, it began with a tiny sound, one that was completely ignored at first. Let's move on to our second story. My name is Lucas Bennett. It happened in August 2024 on the outskirts of Fort Worth, Texas. It was a sweltering Saturday night. My wife Emily and I had set up a small summer camping spot in the backyard for our 2 kids. Our backyard wasn't huge, just a wooden deck, an old barbecue grill, a few lawn chairs, and a small storage shed tucked in one corner. The shed wasn't used much. Inside, we just kept a lawn mower, some gardening tools, and a few old boxes. Around 10:30 p.m., after the kids fell asleep, Emily and I were sitting outside. Everything seemed normal. Then I heard a noise. Tap. I looked up. The sound had come from the direction of the shed. Emily said, "Probably the wind." I smiled and replied, "Yeah, probably." We went back to talking. About 5 minutes later, the noise happened again. Tap. A bit louder this time. I stood up. Shed door? Emily said, "Maybe." Flashlight in hand, I walked toward the shed. The door was closed from the outside. I checked the handle with my hand. Locked. No sound was coming from inside either. I walked back, but a few minutes later, once again, tap. This time, it sounded as if it came from inside the shed. I wasn't smiling anymore. I told Emily, "Stay here." Then I walked back to the shed. I stood in front of the door for a few seconds, listening closely. Nothing. I unlocked it. I shone the flashlight inside. The whole shed was empty. The lawnmower was on one side. A few boxes. Old gardening tools. Nobody was in there. I moved one box. Then another. I found nothing. Finally, I closed the door and returned. Emily asked me, "Anything?" I said, "No." But I still couldn't figure out where the sound was coming from. Around midnight, we went inside the tent. The kids were fast asleep by then. I set my phone aside and lay down. Then, about 20 minutes later, I heard that sound again. Tap. I opened my eyes. Tap. This time, the sound was much clearer, and it wasn't coming from the shed. It was right behind our tent. I held my breath and listened. It sounded as if someone was standing on the grass. I woke Emily up. She opened her eyes and looked at me. I pressed a finger to my lips, signaling her to stay quiet. Then we both heard it. Slow footsteps on the grass. Someone was walking around the tent, first to the right, then behind us, then to the left. I reached toward the tent zipper. Emily grabbed my hand. She shook her head. No, don't go outside. We both stayed completely still and silent. A few seconds later, the footsteps stopped. Then, I heard a voice, speaking in a very low whisper. Lucas? Every muscle in my body froze. He knew my name. I didn't answer. The voice came again. Lucas. Closer this time. Emily was staring at me. I could see in her eyes that she had heard it too. I grabbed my phone. I tried to dial 911, but right then, the sound of a car door slamming came from outside the backyard. Then a few seconds of silence. After that, a car slowly drove away. We waited inside the tent for about 10 minutes. Then I called the police. The officers arrived and searched the entire backyard. At first, they didn't find anyone, but one officer stopped as he shone his flashlight beside the shed. He looked down at the ground and asked, "Did you put these here?" I looked down. An old folding chair was sitting on the ground. It wasn't our chair. Beside it was a small backpack. Inside the bag were water bottles, snacks, an old phone charger, and a hoodie. But the most unsettling discovery was made right behind the shed. An area of the ground was flattened out, as though someone had been regularly sitting or lying there. The officers realized someone had likely been lurking and hiding in our backyard for quite some time. The next day, we checked the security camera footage. Our camera didn't cover the entire backyard. However, one camera caught a slight view of the area next to the shed. In the footage from 9:48 p.m., we saw a man climb over the fence and enter the backyard. He walked straight toward the shed. Then he stayed there for nearly 40 minutes. Yet, he never once opened the shed door. He just stood behind the shed. Then, in one part of the footage, he was seen slowly creeping toward our tent. Emily and I shut the video off. We couldn't watch any further. The police later discovered that the man was a suspect in several local cases of trespassing on private properties in the area. But there was one question we never got an answer to. How did he know my name? No one in our family recognized him. We had never seen him before. We didn't move away to a new house a few weeks later, but we completely overhauled our entire backyard setup. A new fence, motion lights, security cameras, and most importantly, we never slept in a tent in the backyard ever again. Even today, whenever we go camping somewhere outside on a summer night, there's one thing I always check. I don't just use my eyes to see if someone is around. I listen, because a tiny sound in the dark, the snap of a dry twig, or a light tap on a wooden door, might just be something completely ordinary. But sometimes, it isn't meant to warn you. It might simply be because someone has been standing very close to you for a very long time. Friends, that brings us to the end of today's stories on True Horror Vault. Summer nights usually bring us fond memories of joy, vacations, and spending quality time with family. But today's stories might just remind you of one thing. Even if it's your own backyard, once darkness falls, we can't always see what's lurking out there. So if you happen to be sitting outside tonight and suddenly hear a sound coming from the dark corner of your backyard, maybe don't go out to check right away. Wait a moment. Listen closely. Pay attention to your surroundings. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing of all is the one you are looking for might have already found you. I'm your host signing off from True Horror Vault. I'll see you in the next episode with more unsettling, realistic, and dark stories. Until then, stay safe. And remember, you are not always alone in the dark.